What's up, YouTube? This is 82 and 0. Now, there's something I want to address. I've been meaning to do it for a while. Uh, a lot of times people now are saying, how would Bob Cousy fare in the NBA today? And one thing I don't think is fair is that we're not looking at how JJ Redick would do in the NBA back in the 50s and 60s. So, JJ Redick played from 2006, 2007 to 2020, 21. He's a career 44% shooter. In terms of from the field, he's a career 41% three-point shooter. I'd say the highlight of his three-point shooting was in the 15-16 season where he shot 47% from the three-point line and 48% from the field, but he also had seasons where he was below 40%. His last season and 08-09, he shot 39% from three. He's an atrocious defender, averaging 0.4 steals per game, 0.1 blocks per game. He wasn't very athletic, and he pretty much just made his career as being a spot-up shooter. So, there's two things I want to look at here, right? JJ Redick presents himself like everybody in the past and everybody in the 60s was trash. So, let's do a hypothetical right now. Let's say we delete every single NBA team nowadays, right? Let's say every team folds, right? Except for 8 teams, okay? And it doesn't really matter what team. I'm just saying there's only 8 teams left. Now, let's have a dispersal draft with the players. And let's put JJ Redick in the draft. To make it more, to give JJ Redick the benefit of the doubt, let's say it's the 2016 JJ Redick. Probably him at his best. Like I said, with his shooting splits and averaging 16 points per game. So let's just, for the sake of argument here, let's just say the 2016 season had 8 teams, right? And every single team that's remaining has to have a dispersal draft. Do you think JJ Redick in 2016 would make a roster? Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? Because my first argument I want to make is I want to compare JJ Redick to 60s players, okay? But in his modern context, okay? So, not only that, let's say there was no three-point line. We're using the 2015-16 roster, right? Everybody who was playing in the NBA then, down to 8 teams with a dispersal draft, and there's no three-point line. Do you think JJ Redick lasts in that league? Do you think he would be picked? All he could do was spot-up shoot for 3. He's kind of a one-dimensional player. You know, he's not bringing any defense. And although he did average career-high 18 points per game in 2019, it's not like he's the kind of guy that can create his own shot. He's getting it off of spot-up shooting. So, it's kind of hard for me to say that he's this great player to the level of Bob Cousy. Redick never was an all-star. Never MVP. Now, I'm going to take it a step further now. Because it's hard to compare players from different eras. So that's why I kind of wanted to show the 1950s/60s landscape in a modern context and how JJ Redick would fare. But now I want to say, let's teleport JJ Redick to, say, 1950, for example, right? How would he fare back in that era? Now, I do think Redick would be able to make a name for himself. I know I see people today saying, "Oh, JJ Redick couldn't even play in the 50s, and 60s." And I don't think that's true. But let me explain. I think it's just as ridiculous as when people say Kuzi couldn't play in the modern era. So I think Redick has more of a case to be made for himself playing in, say, 1950 when Bob Cousy happened to be drafted. I think because the level of players, the talent of players was constantly and very fastly evolving in the 50s, right? The early 50s compared to even the late 50s was so much different in terms of talent and in terms of size and in terms of athleticism. And I don't think a lot of casual NBA fans really understand this. You know, like they were talking about the 60s like the average role player was just some plumber. It's absolutely fucking ridiculous. Uh, I don't think it resonates with them that and the NBA in 1951 was a much different game than even in 1961. So the point I want to make here is I think Bob Cousy could really make a name for himself in the earlier 50s. I think I could see him being like a Bill Sharman. I'm not saying he's as good as Bill Sharman, but I could see him being that similar play style. Because Bill Sharman was a better defender, no doubt. I'm not saying Bill Sharman was a lockdown defender, but Sharman could create a shot. He could play defense. To a he could play defense at a not an elite level, but a good enough level. Redick couldn't do that. But I'm just saying I could see that being a fair comparison. But let's talk about the 1960s. Okay. Let's say JJ Redick was drafted in 1960. I don't see this fucker. I'm sorry, excuse my language, but this motherfucker really pisses me off with his disrespect of past players. I don't see this guy being a star. I mean, he's one dimensional. And, Wilt Chamberlain said it best back in his era. You had to be able to do a little bit of everything to stay on a roster. There's reasons why guys like John Thompson, for example, only played like 1 or 2 years in the NBA back then. And there's no D-League back then to catch your ass. Of course there were little leagues around the country, but what I mean by that is like you had the CBA, you had the ABL briefly in 1961. But for the most part, come on, there wasn't like a G League to catch Redick from being waived from a team back then. But I really don't think Redick would be a star. I don't see him. Maybe he could be a role player, like a bench player. But here's the thing, too. NBA teams back then in the 60s, they didn't give a lot of minutes to bench players like they do now. Their star players were expected to play over 40 minutes a game. And so if Redick isn't a star player, right? If he's not like a Gail Goodrich or a Jerry West or Hal Greer, Paul Westville, I'm just trying to think of other shooting guards from the 60s. He's just not at that level. So he's not going to be a starter on any team in the 60s. And maybe he could make a name for himself as a bench player, kind of like a Frank Ramsey. But I just don't see this fucker lasting as long as he did. Because there's no 3-point line. If your whole thing is to be a spot-up 3-point shooter, right? You're not going to last. And especially if you play no defense. So, as much as Redick likes to act like Kuzi couldn't play in this era, I don't really think Redick could play in the 60s. Hate on me all you want. But we're not talking about a fucking star player. We're talking about a role player at best. We're not talking about teleporting Kobe Bryant to the 60s, or we're not talking about teleporting LeBron James to the 60s. We're talking about JJ Redick. A lot of these stupid casual NBA fans, they like to act like, these are comments I've heard. Teleport JaVale McGee to the 60s and he'd be Bill Russell. Just because a motherfucker, I just don't think they really understand how good the 60s were. Yeah, they act like it's some dinosaur era, like the Joe Folks era. The NBA in 1967 was much different than the NBA in 1947. I'm sorry, but they had the quickest pace in NBA history. You had to be able to run up and down that court all night long. And like I said, you're playing over 40 minutes a night. Now you got players coming into training camp overweight. You got Zion overweight. You got Luka overweight. James Harden overweight. These guys weren't overweight back then. And I don't like to trash any era. I respect every single era of basketball. And I do think the greats would be good in any era. And role players maybe could be better in other eras than they were in their own. But I'm sorry, I just don't see JJ Redick as being anything in that era. He's not going to be an all-star. He's not going to be an MVP. So let's stop acting like players of the past were just fucking dinosaurs. He couldn't even pick up a basketball today. Like, you got motherfuckers saying that Bob Cousy wouldn't even be able to make a college team. But they act like JJ Redick would be an MVP back in the 60s. Do you really think JJ Redick could run up and down that court for fucking 48 minutes? I don't think JJ Redick even ever played above 30 minutes in a game, or above 30 minutes per game for a season. I don't think JJ Redick was ever a lockdown defender, So let's stop this argument that JJ Redick is so much better than Bob Cousy, okay? Last I checked, I understand how hard it is to compare players in their eras. That's why I wanted to do two kinds of comparisons. I wanted to do a comparison of what Redick would look like in this era, so to speak, a couple years ago, with the 60s, what's the right term to use? With the 60s play style. He wouldn't make a team. He wouldn't make the team back in the 1960s, probably. And I'm just going to come right out and say it. Bob Cousy, I'm sorry, 6-time champion, right? MVP. Sure, his field goal percentages weren't the best. I've criticized him for that, And sure, he wasn't as good as Jerry West or Oscar Robertson in that era. And the thing is, he's still an all-time great. He cemented himself. JJ Redick never did any of that. He wasn't even the fourth or fifth best player on his team, let alone an MVP style player. So I'm getting really tired of hearing this shit about JJ Redick. He's fucking overrated. He's fucking arrogant as shit. I don't understand what the advantage... I don't understand what his motive is in attacking older generations of players. In baseball, for example, a lot of times people revere their legends, but Redick likes to make fun of the older players because they didn't make as much money as him. But fuck, man, JJ Redick didn't make the most money in his era. Sure, he made millions of dollars, but was he ever one of the highest paid players? No. He likes to call former players plumbers and whatnot, but he was a podcaster, was he not? You know, I could see the NBA in 50 years saying, oh, LeBron dominated against podcasters. You know, it's a cycle, man. It will continue. Someday people are going to trash this era and say that they were devoid of talent, that players today weren't athletic because they look at Nikola Jokic, but they don't understand the full story. So I think it's very disrespectful for Redick, who was able to make millions of dollars in his career because of the contributions of players of the past, to shit on them for that. I just don't understand it, man. So he's a glorified role player. He wouldn't be shit back in that era. That's my thoughts on JJ Redick, and I'm done with this shit.